And thank you for joining us for the final Spring 2020 digital panel. Today's webinar is titled From Presentation to Publication. This panel is intended to provide graduate students with an overview of how to prepare a manuscript for publication. Before we get started, I should let everyone know that audience members are muted to limit background noise. If you have questions during the panel, we encourage you to submit those through the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will be visible to all attendees and panelists, and audience members may also upvote questions to prioritize them. The panelists will address questions during the open Q&A period following today's discussion. My name is Awish Aslam, and I am the chair and central rep for the CSA Student Concerns Subcommittee. Our subcommittee also includes our Eastern rep, Emma Kay, and our Western rep, Nicole Millette. Of course, this series would not be possible without the Canadian Sociological Association, so we'd like to thank the CSA for sponsoring this initiative, and a huge thank you to Sherry Fox, the Executive Director for the CSA, for working with us to plan and organize this series. We'd also like to thank everyone in the audience who submitted feedback when registering for this panel. Your questions and comments were used to guide today's discussion, so thank you. We're very fortunate to be joined by three wonderful panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Tracey Adams. Dr. Adams is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Western Ontario. She has spent several years as an associate editor, managing editor, and is now the executive editor of the Canadian Review of Sociology. Dr. Adams is also on the associate editorial board of Work, Employment, and Society and the Journal of Professions and Organization, and she's also served on the editorial board for Gender and Society. Our next panelist is Dr. Pallavi Banerjee. Dr. Banerjee is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Calgary. Her work has been published in Context, American Behavioral Scientists, and Sociological Forum. In an effort to introduce the sociological lens in the public discourse, Dr. Banerjee regularly engages with the media and shares her research through op-eds and blogs. Her forthcoming book, Dismantling Dependence: Gendered Migrations, Visa Regimes, and Construction of Dependence Among High-Skilled Indian Migrant Families by New York University Press, draws on fieldwork from her doctoral project and beyond. Our final panelist, Dr. Lori Wilkinson, is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Wilkinson's recent publications include a co-edited book, Understanding the Outcomes of Refugees, Canada and Germany Compared, and a special issue of Canadian Diversity, which she co-edited. Her research has also been published in several international and national academic journals and reports to national and international governments. Dr. Wilkinson was also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Migration and Integration for 7 years. Thank you all for taking part in this panel. Just before we start our discussion, we'd like to get an idea of how much experience today's audience might have with the publishing process. So I'll give you all a few seconds to respond to the poll that's appearing on your screen. Okay, so looks like just under half of our attendees are new at this, so that's good. Hopefully there'll be a lot to take away. And just over half of you have published something either on your own or possibly have multiple publications. So yeah, hopefully there's something for everyone in this panel. So just to get started with the discussion, our first question is, how do you approach the process of turning a conference presentation into a publishable paper? Dr. Adams, could you please begin the discussion for this question?
Sure, Awish, thank you. for having me here today, and I'm happy to get the conversation started. Of course, how you turn a publishable paper into a publishable paper really depends on, to some extent, the stage that the presentation is at. I mean, sometimes when you're presenting at a conference, you're presenting a paper that's in draft form and you want to get some feedback. Other times you're just putting together some PowerPoint slides to present some findings of research that is ongoing or completed. Either way, what you do for presentation is going to be different. You tend to focus on the findings. You'll provide a bit of context, but the emphasis really is on what you did and what you found. Whereas a publishable paper will have a different balance. You'll have to situate what you're doing much more completely in the literature, in relevant theory, if applicable. You'll have to discuss the methodology with a lot more rigor, elaborate on your findings, and just, have a bit more structure and a bit more rigor. So as you're changing, revising that presentation into a publishable paper, you're going to want to think a bit more about, what the contribution is that you want to make. This is especially true if you've presented something that is a series of findings from a study that you're doing. Where you might not actually be able to present all the findings, right? You'll want to focus on a few you think are particularly impactful. And so you're going to sort of narrow your focus. You're going to try and understand sort of where you think you can make the contribution. And then I think as you revise the paper for publication, it's really helpful to have a journal or a few journals in mind. Because how you frame the paper will really depend on the type of journal and its mandate. Are you going to submit to a generalist journal, or is it going to be a specialist journal? Is it a sociology journal or an interdisciplinary journal? Is that a more theoretical oriented or an empirical oriented journal? What kinds of articles are being published in these journals? How long is the article length? I mean, all those decisions would end up sort of producing very different papers. So, I would recommend that you spend some time sort of looking at different journals, reviewing mission statements, considering the kinds of work that they publish. Look at the kind of work you're drawing on in your literature review. Where is work in your field being published? Where can you make the contribution? Where is the audience that will be interested in reading your work? And of course, if you have a question about an article's suitability for certain journals, you can email the editor to ask about it. But once you have an idea of the few journals you might want to target, then you can just design the article, right? Again, an article aimed at a sociology journal will look different than one at an interdisciplinary journal. You'll be drawing on different literatures. You'll be speaking to different audiences. And also keep in mind that the journal itself, I once had an editor from another journal say to me that they considered their journal a conversation, and they want new publications to really contribute to that conversation. So it does help if you have a sense of that journal that you're aiming for, like what kinds of conversations are going on in that journal? How are you going to contribute to that? And so then once you've done that, again, it's about revising the pieces, right? Making sure the literature is geared towards the journal, include citations from the journal, engage in the debates that journal is engaging in, really lay out that literature review, clarify your methods, make sure those are sharp and clear, clarify your research questions, clarify your contribution. This is going to involve a lot of editing and rewriting, and a lot of sort of consideration. But it's not work you necessarily have to do alone, even if this is a sole authored paper. You really should be sharing drafts of your paper with colleagues, with supervisors, anyone really who's willing to give feedback, because it can be really hard to know when a paper's ready for submission, but the feedback you get from the people you circulate it to will really let you know if it's ready. And I guess my only other tip, there'll be time to talk about things later, but you'll want to make sure that the paper is sort of formatted for a journal and follows their style guide if there is one.
Great, thank you. Do any of our other panelists want to speak to that question?
This is Pallavi. I'll just add a couple things to Dr. Adams's, really great directionality in which you could turn a conference paper into a publishable paper. I think the other strategies that I often tell my students to take into account is which conferences to send your papers to. So for instance, a lot of sociology conferences in Canada as well as internationally require you to send in an abstract, right? And so when you're sending in an abstract, your work can be at any stage. It does not have to be complete, or it does not have to, you do not even have to have conceptualized a paper. So oftentimes I have found, both in my own experiences and when working with students, that if you can select a conference, it does not have to be every year, every other year, where you need to submit a nearly full paper or a working paper, but a paper that looks like a paper, that's often slightly easier to convert that into a publishable paper, because what you're doing then is that this paper usually goes through a conference review process, and then you can solicit particular feedback at the conference around the paper and sort of mold it into more of a publishable paper. So selecting conferences can also play a role in converting your presentation into a publishable paper sooner than later, I would say.
Thank you. Laura, did you want to add?
Yes, please. But before I do, I'd like to acknowledge that since I'm in Winnipeg, I'm sitting in the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people. I'm also sitting on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, and we acknowledge the harms of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you very much. I wish, and to the Students Concerned Subcommittee, not only for organizing this workshop, but also for organizing the other 8 workshops. I think it's been a tremendous amount of work for you and Sherry, but my understanding is that this has been a great venue. So to add just a couple of things to the great answers given by Pallavi and Tracey, sometimes at a conference, you're invited to write a paper for either a special issue of a journal or as a chapter, as a book. And so in those cases, when you're approached to do this, the idea is that you follow the directions of like the conference organizer, or the person who's editing either the book or the journal article. And so there'll be important instructions that you need to follow in terms of the formatting, of how much space you have to present your information. So that's increasingly a popular venue as well for publishing. And in my humble experience, it's been the easiest way to get something published is if somebody invites you, especially if it comes from a conference presentation. That said, I don't think I'm taking away from what we will be talking about. Sometimes there's predatory journals that come by, and they'll say, you'll get this nice little email that says, oh, we read your thesis and it's wonderful, and we'd like you to publish it as a book with our publishing company. And usually, sadly, they haven't read your thesis. Secondly, they probably charge you a lot of money to publish your book. And thirdly, you're usually signing away a lot of the copyright issues that you own as an academic. And so if you get an invitation out of the blue, and it's not from a known scholar, it's not from a publisher that you know about, or you're not sure, please do talk to your professor, because your professor usually can help you sort the good invitations from the bad invitations. But there's also a list of predatory journals that you can look at too, to make sure that you're not getting sucked in to these predatory type publications that will get you nowhere. And sadly, students in the recent past have been sucked in, and actually some professors have been too. So you need to be aware of that. And sometimes these predators will look at the conference registration and the titles of the papers. Oh, we were at your conference and we think your paper is wonderful, when in fact, this is publicly known information. They just use this to try to take advantage of you.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for your comments on that question. Our second question is, what is the process of turning a dissertation into a book? Dr. Banerjee, given your forthcoming book that draws on some of the work that you did in your PhD, can I please ask you to start things off?
Sure. Thank you, Wish, and thank you again for inviting us on this panel and for organizing this and for all the work that has gone in to organize these workshops and these wonderful workshops, which is so important for the student community. So thanks for doing that. And thank you, Sherry, for hosting this. Yes, so I will be talking about turning a dissertation into a book, which I've been doing for the last 4 years. So, it's, you know, at the offset, I want to say that it's sort of a long process, because it seems, you know, at the end of it, you get sick of it and all of that, because you start your dissertation work much earlier than you actually convert it into a book. But there are a few questions that I think we should ask early on. And this we should ask before we, you know, when we are actually conceptualizing our dissertation. So the first question would be, can your dissertation be a book? Right? So can your dissertation actually, can you see your dissertation being a book? And I say this because writing a book is a really different kind of an intellectual exercise than writing papers. And books are something that we are not taught to write. We are not trained in writing in graduate school. We are trained in writing papers. But the only time that you actually think of like a long form writing is when you're doing your dissertation. So my answer to that question is, can your dissertation be a book? Is that any dissertation can be a book if you want to tell a story through your dissertation, right? So one narrative, one story, if you're answering one question, embedded in which would be different questions, but if you are doing that in your dissertation, you can convert it into a book. There is this conception and this idea that only books that use qualitative methods, ethnographic methods can be converted, dissertations can be converted into a book. That's not always true. It's easier, but not always true. So do not shy away from thinking about your dissertation as a book, even if you're doing quantitative work, right? So that's sort of the first tip I have. So then the second thing that you should ask yourself is if you are a book writer or not. And this is another sort of orienting that you need to be doing to yourself early on. So writing, as I said, writing a book is a pretty different type of an intellectual exercise. What that means is that you need three things to write a book. You need to have patience, because you're not cranking out a paper, you know, and papers can take a long time, don't get me wrong, but it's not like you're looking at your data. You are trying to fit into this modular template of a journal and trying to get something out rather quickly. Books can take, you know, years. So you need to have patience. You need to be able to put your project into a long form way of conceptualization and writing, which is often, again, a very different intellectual exercise. And the third thing is that you need to sort of diversify in the sense that even if you're writing a book, you should also have enough material to produce a paper or a couple papers or more than that as you're writing your book, right? So, and if this seems too much, then you should probably, at least, you know, for the first thing that you produce from your dissertation, you should then focus on getting papers out and not put all your eggs in the book basket. And that often I've seen be very stressful and often debilitatingly stressful for new assistant professors, people who are just getting into their first academic jobs, right? So that's sort of a balance that you need to sort of, and again, you don't have to do this yourself. You can talk to your mentors, you can talk to your supervisors, you can talk to your peers, you all are junior scholars, you can talk to other people who are in these shoes to determine if you want to be a book writer and if your dissertation can be a book. Now, if you decide that you want to convert your dissertation into a book, I think you again should sort of think about this pretty early on as you're writing your dissertation. One of the advices that I got was to write my dissertation as if I was writing a book, right? And I did that. So and there are certain things that your dissertation will need that you may not be able to do, or you should not, or often, editors say that do not write your book like you're talking to a journal audience. With what that means is do not use overtly jargonish language, don't have a chapter which is a literature review, right? Like, try to embed those things in across chapters, try to speak to a broader audience. But in a dissertation, you also need to display that you know your field really, really well and you have done your work, right? So that part of your dissertation will be part of your dissertation. And so it's sort of the separating that out and making your empirical chapters seem more sort of suited for a book. Now, having said that, I would say that once you are, done with your dissertation, and you have your first job or you have a postdoc and you're thinking about what to publish from your dissertation and you're thinking of converting your dissertation into a book, you should then think of publishers. Who do you want to publish with, right? And as Lori was suggesting, that early on, and this is happening more and more, even more than when I, got out of graduate school, is you will be if you have a compelling enough dissertation that looks like a book, you will be approached by numerous publishers who will be like, oh, this is great, we will convert your dissertation into a book. And some of them will dangle this carrot of converting your dissertation into a book as is, you do not have to make any changes, just give it to us and we will publish it and pay us some money. And those are predatory journals. Predatory publishers, do not fall for that. And I know that Lori will be talking about predatory journals and publishers in a bit, and I don't want to take that space, but I also want to kind of emphasize that there are predatory journals and there are not predatory journals who will also approach you, but these are for-profit journals, and some of these journals, a lot of academics publish with, like Palgrave Macmillan and Lynn Reimer are some of the journals that are publishers that come to mind. But I would suggest that as your first book, do not take the easy route. Take the route of going to, if you are thinking of a future in academia, right? Go to publishers that have a slightly more rigorous process, which would be university process, right? So university process. And recently, university presses have been emphasizing that even if you wrote your dissertation like a book, your book needs to be different than your dissertation, right? Different enough that they are not the same publications. And the reason for that is your dissertation is considered a publication. Your dissertation gets citations. Your dissertation actually gets published through your university libraries, right? So your book needs to be different from your dissertation. And I will give you a quick example of what I did, and this kind of leads me to my second question, is when to publish your book. But I as I was thinking of redrafting my dissertation into a book, I took my first 2 years in my postdoc to do some more data collection. And, I did more interviews. I sort of did follow-up interviews. I did some more archival research to bolster my dissertation, the dissertation work, the dissertation research that I had done, to produce a book that looks different from my dissertation, even though the research questions that I asked in my dissertation and my book are similar or same, right? So I have few additional chapters in my book. I have some new data that I analyzed throughout my book. So the end product of that is that even though the research questions and some of the data is the same, and I did borrow from my dissertation, which is the advantage of writing a dissertation like a book. My book looks completely different than a dissertation, right? So then it comes to the question of publishers, how to choose a publisher or a press for your book. So, so one of the things that I started doing in the second year of my postdoc is I started talking to various university presses, and so I'll start with the process of approaching a press and a publisher, and then I'll say how that kind of goes in person. So before so I was in the US, so I was going to several conferences, but the big conference in the US is the American Sociological Association conference. So about 4 months before the conference, I had this little blurb about my book, and I started approaching university presses saying that this is what, I'm writing a book, this is what the book is about, the blurb is very clear, would you be interested in talking to me about this and potentially, how to go about this. So this is to gauge interest in your book. If you see that you're receiving responses from various presses, you know that you have a book here that you have found interest in. So what I did have a few editors of different presses ask me to meet them during the conference and make particular time with them. And this is important because the editors of these presses, when they go to conferences, are very busy. And they usually don't like if you show up at their stalls and ask to talk to them. They already have made appointments, so do not do that. Make appointments beforehand. And then you basically talk to the various presses that are interested and try to gauge which editor will give you the kind of support you need, right? And so once you have gauged that, and what, they will usually give you a sheet or, direct you to their website to tell you what you would need to do to submit a proposal, right? So some presses require that you submit the whole manuscript. Some presses require that you have a proposal and a few chapters. Some presses say half of the book. So it depends on what the press requires. So once you have that figured out, you work on your proposal and your sample chapters, or, if you want to submit the whole manuscript, and then you send your manuscript out to publishers. Now, some presses want you to submit, so it's like submitting to a journal where you just submit to one press and that's it. I mean, they require you that you do exclusive submissions. Other presses do not require that at the beginning stages, right? And more presses are not requiring you to submit your proposal at the beginning exclusively to one press because of the demands of an early academic career, right? Because you could not, I mean, book reviews can take much longer than journal reviews. So usually at the first stage, you send it out to a few presses, not 10, but you pick top three, and then you send it to the top three. And and then see what results come back. Some presses upfront would say that we can't send this out for reviews. This is not something that we are publishing right now. Others will send it out for reviews, and then once the reviews come in, you have to take a decision. If all three want to give you a contract, it's at that time that you decide that this is, I'll go with this, and that's when you pull your manuscript from the other presses, right? So this has sort of been my experience and the experience of my colleagues and peers so far. When to, and I'll end this with when to publish. So this is sort of tricky, right? I decided, for instance, to not work or publish my book during my postdoc years because I wanted it to be part of my tenure file, right? So I sort of did the more research, more field work during my postdoc years, and did a separate project during my postdoc years through which I published different things than my dissertation, related but different. And I started working on the book once I had my first assistant professorship position, my tenure track position. Now, other people, with the increasing demands of the job market, I feel like a lot of people are publishing their first books while in the postdoc, and that's completely acceptable if you have a second project, where if you are a book writer and if you are thinking of a second book, and if you have a second project in the works through which you can publish a second book during your tenure track, some universities would accept your book that you have published in your postdoc as towards your tenure file, and others wouldn't. So those are things to know. But yeah, so there is, I don't have a really good answer to when to publish your first book. But if you have if your first job is a tenure track job, then you're golden. If not, you sort of have to take that call. So I'll end there, and I'll see if Tracey or Laurie have things to add.
Great, thank you so much. That was really thorough. Did anybody else want to add additional comments?
I did want to say a couple of things. It was very thorough, a lot of great information. So thanks, Pallavi. I just, a few quick things I wanted to say. One is just to, I guess, give an additional endorsement. A lot of students that I talk to really feel like doing a 3-article dissertation is the way to go, and that's the most productive way of being a scholar. But taking everything into account that Pallavi said, if you're a book writer, if you've got this idea that's comprehensive, to some extent a 3-article thesis, you may be selling yourself short. With a good dissertation that's in monograph form, you may be able to get a book and 3 or 4 articles from it. So don't shy away from doing a monograph if that's something you really want to do. The other thing I wanted to say is that the University of Toronto Press has a neat little book. It's old now, but I think it's very relevant, and it's called The Thesis and the Book. And it is just a little book that tells you exactly how to turn your thesis into a book, that you're writing for different audiences, and just sort of gives you steps along the way for making those revisions. When I was turning my thesis into a book, it was super helpful. And I know they have a revised edition since then. And the other thing I just wanted to add is that, just to strengthen what Pallavi said, it's really valuable to talk to editors as you're doing this process, find out what kind of books they're publishing, what they might be interested in. And while there's a great opportunity to do that at ASA, Congress is also a great opportunity. But even outside of that, email editors. There's acquisition editors for the major university presses. The contact information for people in your field is published there on the website. So, drop them an email, make a phone call, make an appointment. They're usually quite willing and eager to talk to potential authors. So don't hesitate to do that.
And just to add a couple of things, I want to make a pitch for the importance of the proposal. you're not only just up against all the sociologists who want to write books and publish them, you're up against all the other academics from all the other disciplines who want to publish. And so it's really important that you pay attention to the content of the proposal. This is where, I hate to use this language, but this is where you sell your topic. It's kind of like if any of you participated in the 3-minute thesis challenge, or if you think of an elevator pitch, right? The Prime Minister of Canada comes onto your elevator and you've got a couple of minutes to tell him what you do. That's what the proposal is all about, is what is your main research problem or question, and what is the interesting findings or gaps that you can contribute to filling? Because a lot of the proposals that publishers get are not very clear. They're just kind of copy and pasting bits from your thesis or dissertation when it goes to the reviewers, because the publishers will send it to a set of reviewers at the proposal stage. If the reviewers can't make sense of what you want to accomplish, then you're not going to get a positive response from the publisher. Sometimes the publisher asks you to identify potential reviewers. Please do that, because chances are the publishers will pick their own set of reviewers, but they'll also draw some of the reviewers from your list. So this is where you have an opportunity to put down the names of scholars who know you or who know your work or can comment concretely about your work. So I think thinking about those two aspects will help you get your dissertation turned into a book.
Perfect, thank you all. Okay, so our next question is, how do I turn my thesis or dissertation into a series of articles? And Dr. Wilkinson, could you please share your thoughts on that?
Sure thing. So I kind of think the jury's out, whether you should turn your thesis or dissertation into a book or to a set of articles. And so what I did actually is I went with articles. Maybe it was the period of time that I was graduating. So I graduated in 2000. And it was, in the job market at that time, it was more important to have articles than a book. Usually the book came after. But now I'm seeing with CVs on job postings and job selection committees that I've been on, there's more and more people with books. So I kind of think it goes either way, to be honest. The way we organize our dissertation theses are a little bit different too. So Pallavi alluded to this when she was talking about how is your thesis or your dissertation organized. So kind of like I don't want to call it the historical way, but a traditional way of organizing your dissertation or thesis is to organize it in terms of findings chapters. So for a typical master's thesis, you have one findings chapter. That kind of relates to the hopes that you would maybe turn your thesis into one journal article, and that's kind of the expectation. For a dissertation, you generally have 3 findings chapters, sometimes 4, sometimes 2, but more than 1. So basically your findings chapters kind of give you clues as to what you should be writing for your first set of papers. So in my dissertation, I had 3 major findings chapters, which I turned into 3 journal articles. And along the way, I used this process to start building up my research agenda, which was also very important. But we have a new way, or especially in disciplines like economics, for instance, but our friends in the natural sciences have been doing this for a long time. It's called the sandwich thesis. This is where you have an introductory chapter and then 3 or 4 published journal articles in the middle and a conclusion chapter at the end. And so the introduction and the conclusion kind of try to wrap these 4 papers or attach them to one another. There's a certain amount of attractiveness to doing it that way too, because you're publishing as you're going along as a PhD student, and that transition from dissertation to thesis dissertation to article or thesis to article isn't as onerous. So there's some people who don't like that version, but I'm seeing the sandwich thesis a little bit in the sociology department too. regardless of what your thesis looks like, do not send like your thesis, your 50 or 100-page thesis to a journal expecting it to publish it like that. Because I actually, when I was a journal editor, we'd get that quite a bit. You know, somebody would send their 50-page master's thesis, publish this. Like, this is not how you approach this. So a typical journal article in the social sciences is about 7,500 words. So one of the things that you want to look at is, what are the requirements of the journal that you've selected? Does it give you 10,000 words? Does it give you 7,500 words? Do those word counts include your bibliography? And for students, you're going to have these huge bibliographies that eats up a lot of your word space. And so making sure that you pay attention to the word limit, because you don't want an editor to just throw your paper away by saying, well, it's too long, you know, just I'm rejecting this. And in some journals, they have to do that. I had to do that when I was editing a journal. I was the only editor. I had no associate editors. I had no helpers. And the number of papers I would get per year was 375 to 425 papers a year, with one person to review them all. So you can see how tiny little things where you don't pay attention to the word count can just cause the journal to reject your paper without review. I think working closely with your professor will also help you, in most cases, turn your chapters into articles. Most professors I know, they work very closely with their students, and one of their goals is to help them take their research into publication. And so, you know, your first point should be your professor. Although most universities on campus also have writing centers that can help you, especially if you're having trouble with grammar. Because that's the other thing that you want to article to the journal editor, because if the journal editor or the reviewers can't make sense of what you're saying because your writing is so poor, you are also going to get rejected, even though the research itself might be good. So, and many of the other tips that Pallavi and Tracey talked about in terms of turning your book into, or turning your dissertation into a book, would also apply as well. But for the most part, you want to approach a journal article like you're writing a research paper, and that you want to get an A+ on that research paper, so that the professor, or in this case, the editor, says that they want you to publish in their journal. So I think that's all I had to say about that.
Great, thank you. Did any of the other panelists want to?
I don't have too much to add, honestly, because I also do think that some of the things we've covered and some of the things we'll cover under other categories. But I do, just want to reiterate that, you'll have to carve a piece out, whether you have like a monograph thesis where it's sort of a whole, or like a sandwich or manuscript type thesis where it's separate papers. You can't really just probably take that chapter and send it out. You'll need to, again, like write it for a journal. So carve out a piece of it, edit it down, or just, write up it, and you'll have to restructure, rethink, and redesign a little bit as you send that out. And then all the other things that, I've talked about before and that we will talk about in terms of just how to publish a paper also come into play. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you.
And I'll add a couple more points to the already great points made by both Lori and Tracey. Is so even if you are writing a book, right? If you are a book person, so to say, if you identified yourself as a book person, your dissertation. So one of the things to keep in mind is that if, I'm a strong advocate of not putting all your eggs into the book basket, because it can take a while to publish it. So keep publishing articles while you are writing a book, and it's a lot, but that's sort of the nature of the game. And one of the things that I found out was that most university presses are okay with you using a couple of your articles as chapters in the book, right? So it can be sort of a third of your book can be articles. I mean, not as is, because you will of course not have the literature review or the methodology sections in those chapters, but you can use the empirical part of those chapters, extend them, make them more narrative, make them more suited to the audience in the book, but you can do that. The other part of this is, again, for people who are thinking of their dissertations as books, is that there, you know, a book, even though the book is not 9,000 words and it's usually 80,000 words, often you have more data than you can accommodate in a book even, right? So having that frame, that what part of your data are you not using for your book, can also be a good way of producing articles and things that you've actually not even thought about in your dissertation. So reworking your data from your dissertations to articles is really fun, outside of, you know, writing a book. So I'll just add those two things.
Great, thank you. Okay, so our next question is, what should you keep in mind when you're writing? Are there common pitfalls or mistakes that you see when reviewing articles, as well as any tips on what might improve your chances of having a paper accepted? Dr. Adams is someone who has quite a bit of experience from the editor perspective. I'd like to turn things to you, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, a lot of my comments actually really echo what, you know, Lori was saying earlier. You know, as a journal editor, you quite often get articles that where people just haven't done the basics, right? A lot of journals have mission statements, they have style guidelines, they have length requirements. The number of papers that come to us where, you know, people don't seem to have any idea of what kinds of things, you know, you might publish, how long they should be, you know, what kind of citations you should have, what guidelines you should follow. You know, if those are a common pitfall. So, you know, when you're submitting an article to a journal, again, think of it like the journal, especially if it's a specialty journal, they're having a conversation and you want to join it. So you should be looking at articles published in that journal. You should consider their format, considering what kinds of issues they find is important. Look at them for style. How are they structured? Follow the style guidelines, follow the formatting. And meet the journal's guidelines. A lot of journals, not all of them, but a lot of them will reject your work instantly if it is over the word limit, if it isn't formatted according to the journal's guidelines. You know, if it doesn't meet their specifications, they'll instantly send it back. Now, journals can vary on this. Some tend to be a little bit flexible. I've certainly published in a lot of journals that if they say that word limit is 8,000 and you submit something that's 8,005, they're sending it back to you so that you can fix it, because they won't review it until you've met their guidelines. So you really, that's a good first step. And then in terms of other things, I would say like common reasons or common things that reviewers comment on in journal articles, or common things that come up, are just to, that your methodology isn't well enough explained, that you haven't gone to enough lengths to sort of clarify how you're contributing to the literature, that you don't have clear research questions, you know, which may or may not be hypotheses, but, you know, what are you doing in the article? What do you hope to achieve? What are you contributing? You really need to spell that out for reviewers and editors. And, you know, just try and have the paper that's fairly well structured, you know, introduction, and make sure it's embedded in a literature, situated in theory, if that's applicable, that your methodology is really clear, that your findings, you know, are well described, you know, no matter what kind of paper you're publishing, and that in the discussion you've wrapped everything together, and again, you've spelled out for everybody what your contribution is. Different papers are going to have different structures, different journals are going to have different expectations. So again, that's why you learn those expectations before you submit something. Yeah, I think that's probably the main thing that I'll say. I guess one of the sub questions was about tables. So tables can be helpful in qualitative and historical work, and those can be helpful as well. Some journals don't include tables in the word count. And that is when a table is your best friend as a qualitative or historical researcher, because you can cram a lot of words into a table and it's not counting against you. But, you know, whether you include them or not really just depends on the paper and what you're trying to, the message you're trying to get across.
Great, thank you so much. Does anybody, Dr. Wilkinson, did you want to add?
Sure. I kind of came at this question as a writer. So my number one tip to you guys, and you're probably all going to roll your eyes, is use your campus writing services because you pay for them already. And you're going to think, oh, I don't have time. Like I've got all these deadlines and I have to pump this stuff out. Thing is that the time that you invest right now in learning how to write well will pay off enormously, regardless of whether or not you stay in academia or not. All of us, even I, need help with my writing. And so getting some feedback, you know, like a diagnosis of your writing problems at this stage in your career will be enormously beneficial. And I cannot stress that enough to you, even though I would say probably only 20% of my students listen to that advice. But it pays off for them because later on, the time that they put in right now to perfecting their writing, it makes their writing time shorter down the road. And you become a much stronger communicator too. And so on the job market, that's a very important qualification. A good writer can probably peel off about 3 pages a day. Some days you can do more. Like some days if I'm like completely under absolute stress and deadlines, I can do a bit more, but really good quality writing on a sustained basis is about 3 pages a day. And good writers try to set aside at least some blocks of time during the week. Now, in the ideal world, we'd set off a set of time to write every day. So far, I haven't found that ideal world yet, but it's a goal that you should strive for as a student, and it's a good practice. But don't be hard on yourself if you have a bad day. Like if you can only get 1 sentence out today, or you can only correct the grammar in 1 paragraph, that's okay. But know when you're hitting writer's block and know where you can get help. And so this is where, you know, joining a writing group. Most universities have writing groups for grad students, and many of the departments of sociology have writing groups for their graduate students. So you might think to yourself, well, this is dumb, right? Why would I join a writing group? Why would I sit in a room and write with people? Or nowadays, my students are actually doing this on Zoom and writing. It gives you, you know, it helps you set that block of time apart, but it also makes you accountable to other people in your group too, so that, because sometimes you just need some accountability outside of your professor to help you produce stuff. And your writing group hopefully will give you feedback on your writing, which will help you become a better writer. And then as you give your feedback to your fellow colleagues, that's going to help you become a better writer too. So I'm a big fan of writing groups as well, you know, as a way of kind of disciplining or organizing yourself to become a good writer.
I just have a couple points to add to that. So one is the emphasis on feedback, right? And who you can get feedback. And at the early stages, getting feedback is really, really, not early stages, I take that back, at all stages, writing, getting feedback is really important. And they can be your peers, and a writing group is a great way of getting to that, right? Like you share your writing. You also need to be mindful of how much you share, right? Sometimes like sharing a page or 2 pages can be really effective, and that would, you know, not take a lot of bandwidth on parts of your peers and writing group, but also asking people who are in your field. Usually academics tend to be really busy and tend to turn you down and things like that, but don't be deterred by no's. There'll be one yes at some point, and that can kind of reshape your writing. And so don't shy away from approaching people who are in your field to review your work before you send it out, though being mindful of sympathetic reviewers. You don't want to burn your sympathetic reviewers by making them review your piece before it's gone out. So these people could be reviewing it more sympathetically, maybe like they are politically invested in your work, right? So those decisions, and you could ask your advisor, supervisor, mentors about who to send your work out for reviews. So that's sort of one tip that I have. The second tip is writing is political. Cite people who are not cited. Cite Black women, cite Indigenous women. I mean, writing anything is political, and we do not want to perpetuate the structures of oppression in our writing. So as new scholars, try and kind of, and there is a lot of resistance to that in sociology. I will have to say, we are not a decolonized field. We are not yet an anti-racist field, but draw upon the support of your mentors and your supervisors to do that kind of political work in your writing, where you are balancing who you are reading, who you are writing, and who you're citing as political work, and try and do that as much as you can, though I know that you will face resistance, and you can take such risks at different times in your career, but you can push a little and say that, this person has written about this, but why am I citing a dead white man over and over again when I can cite a Black feminist scholar for this, right? So you can do a little bit of sneaky activism in your writing.
Thank you all. Those are all really, really helpful points. Moving to our next question, where should you be publishing? So with this question, people are interested to know just generally how to find a good home for your paper, as well as the importance of publishing in Canadian versus American journals, and how that might affect your ability to secure a tenure track position at a Canadian research university. Dr. Wilkinson, could we hear from you to start, please?
Sorry, my mute wasn't unmuting. So, I mean, I'm always, as long as you have a good relationship with your professor, I think talking to your professor will help guide you as to appropriate venues for you to publish, as well as to guide you away from inappropriate venues like those scam journals that we were telling you about. You'll have a pretty good idea too once you're becoming to the end of your research, because you'll see certain journals in your field you'll see them repeated in your research. And so if you see a journal a lot in your research area, that is also probably a good indication that it's a good place to publish. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you should be publishing in the Canadian Review for Sociology. It is the important one of the sociological journals in Canada, but in my mind, the most important. I think it's the oldest too, although maybe Tracey can correct me on that. Maybe. But amongst sociologists, the Canadian Review of Sociology does have a good reputation. It doesn't have the same reputation as the American Sociological Association's journals, but that's because the United States is a much bigger audience and has much a bigger ability to expand internationally. But I think, for a journal of its size, you all should think seriously about the Canadian Review of Sociology. It's hard to tell, it's hard for me to tell you though, what are the other top journals, because sociology being a field that touches so many different disciplines, right? Like addictions, people work in that area, disaster training, health sociology, criminology, right? You all have a different kind of set of journals that that you refer to in your work based on the topic of your thesis or your dissertation. So this is again where your professor can help, but also your librarians. Not very many people talk to a librarian about publishing, and they know an awful lot about what it takes to get published and what are the hot journals and what are the hot topics. And so every university has a sociology librarian or a social science librarian, and I think those people are untapped resources as well. What about open access journals? So if you are funded by the Tri-Council agencies, or the research work that you are doing is funded by the Tri-Council, there is a requirement that you have to publish in an open access place. It's hard to navigate that. And the requirement is good, right? Because the Tri-Council agencies are publicly funded, it is ethical for us to make sure that our research is openly accessible to the Canadian public who funds us. But again, where do you publish in terms of open access journals? What's a good one? What's a bad one? What are the rules around the open access journal versus the journal that you want to publish? So, I'm not an expert on open access issues, but many of your universities have like their own web space where you can put early drafts of your papers that haven't been accepted for publication. That generally is an accepted practice, although take a look at the journal that you're wanting to publish in, because some journals won't allow you to do this. So if you've publicly posted your paper or some very close looking version of your paper on an open access area or on a website, and then you attempt to publish it in that journal, they might say no. So it's worth your while to think ahead where you might want to publish this academically through peer review. And the peer review is going to change the look of that publication anyways. Usually a peer review, you get 2 or 3 people commenting on your journal article. They'll give you corrections to make, and those corrections will shape that paper in a way that probably makes it maybe a little bit different, or probably a lot different than what you've already published. So there's that, that issue. The other issue though too is many of you are public sociologists, and I think it's really important as well to publish in non-academic journals too, especially if you're publicly funded, but also because these venues actually get a lot of attention. So many of us have trade journals. Like if you work in the field of social work or social psychology, there's trade journals that practitioners work in and regularly read. There's community publications as well. So in my field, most of the immigrant and refugee settlement agencies have venues where you can share research reports too, and they can be different than your published articles, but they can bring value as well, because the people who read those types of articles, and those articles tend to be shorter, like 1,500 to 3,000 words. If you catch somebody's eye in that venue, they're more likely to look up your academic research, and it's kind of like a 2-for-1, right? So you have a preview article that's short in a lay language that people can understand, and then a more academic, jargon-laden research in an academic journal. So it gets your word out a bit more. And so another venue I'd like to plug is something called the Conversation Canada. And as a professor, I read that every day. Because I learn stuff inside my discipline, but outside my discipline as well. And oftentimes, I'll be introduced to new and up and coming scholars in the field. And so I'll do a Google search for them to see what else they've written, because I'll become curious about their work based on what they've written in the conversation. So you have these kind of ways of drawing people or giving attention to your research that aren't necessarily buried in an academic journal that's hard to find. So I think as aspiring scholars and academics, publishing in those areas doesn't get enough attention, yet this is the kind of exposure that might help you in your career. So those are my thoughts on where you should publish, but I know that Pallavi and Tracey have different ideas too.
Great, thanks so much. Oh, Dr. Banerjee, did you want to?
Sure. I think Lori covered most of it. There is a question about, is publishing in Canadian journals sufficient to obtain a tenure track position? I would say publish in, I mean, it's a very neoliberal way of like thinking publish or perish, but the job market is so competitive if you want to get into academia. I think if you publish in a peer-reviewed journal which is not predatory and which has where you don't pay to publish, I think at the graduate student level, publishing in any journal in Canada or outside would build up to your tenure track, making you more competitive in the tenure track job searches, I would say. But so that's one thing that I would want to emphasize. The second is building off of what Lori was talking about in terms of publishing outside of academic journals like op-eds and such. Those are not easy either. I wanted to emphasize that. Though they are quicker, but not necessarily easier, because, like, for instance, in conversations, you have to put on a pitch and there will be an editor who will be vetting it, right? So you can actually get rejections when you're trying to pitch an op-ed. And so, I just wanted you to know that pitching an op-ed does not mean you get in, because it's not an academic journal. So they can be, and of course they are of value. In fact, there's this little anecdote that the first piece that was used from my research for policy change was actually an op-ed that I had published in Miss Magazine, which is this feminist magazine out in the US. And they actually used that piece instead of a journal article that I had on the same topic, right? Because that was more easily accessible, and that could be put on this policy report that the US government used at the time for it. So yeah, so there is a lot of value in that, but they are not necessarily easier to publish in.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so we have one last discussion question before we get into the Q&A, and that is, what role do collaborations play, and how might you approach collaborating when it comes to publishing? And I was wondering, Dr. Banerjee, if you could maybe start us off.
Sure, and I'll keep it short because I'm aware that we are, running out of time. So if any people have questions about collaborations, we can answer them later. But yeah, so collaborations are important because, especially now in sociology, more people publish with other folks, right? Like it used to be that sociology was more like humanities, where you are doing your sole siloed scholarship and then you're publishing on your own, and particularly coming out of a dissertation, that it seems like that's the way to go because it's your research, you will be publishing it. But I think looking for venues for collaboration is really important, and I'll give you like two quick tips here. One is publishing with your supervisor, right? Like, if there is a paper that you want to write, but you are not being able to frame it, don't be afraid to approach your supervisor to say that, can we work on this together, right? Like, or, can you help me shape this in a way that this becomes publishable? Or getting on your supervisor's research as research assistants. And a lot of my publications when I was a grad student came out of my research assistantship gigs, right? So I was research assistants with various faculty, not only my supervisor or advisor, but other faculty, and I had I got publications out of those projects with somebody who was running that project, a faculty. So it was also an opportunity for mentorship, right? So I got mentored in publication while working on RA ships. And that's often some faculty are more generous about that. They would say, if you work with me, I will ensure that you have at least one publication out of this project. And others are not. So don't be shy to ask that, is there opportunities for publication if I am a part of this research group, right? And they can come in the form of journal articles or other kinds of reports, like Lori said, right? Or other forms, but something that helps you get that first thing out or get the first few things out. So collaborations with faculty, collaboration with peers is also something that I have really had really great experience with. So I was part of a writing group of, of 4 graduate students who all worked with the same faculty members. So we were 4 people working with my supervisor, and we were in this writing group, and through this writing group and our weekly interactions, we came up with different things that we could collaborate on and carve out niche areas of interest. And so some of my publications, journal article publications, came out of those peer collaborations, right? So kind of try and see if you can get those. But in those, and also in publishing with faculty and supervisors and other, members in either in your university or outside, issues of authorship and such, those need to be sort of worked out early on. But this is more important when you're doing a publication with your peers, right? So who are you going to be equal authors? Are you going to, is somebody going to take a lead and they are going to be the first authors? And, if there are multiple authors, how do you navigate that? So these questions need to be sort of worked out early on in the process so that the process of collaboration does not become something that is stressful or, that breaks your friendships and your peer relationships apart. There was this one question, is it better to be the sole author or published with others? I think you need to have the balance of both. So you have some pieces, some of your, some of the things that come out of your dissertation, that's your core research should be sole authored because you are the crafter and the creator of that project, but there can be other things that can be co-authored. And why is it important to co-author? Well, it's division of labor. That's one. I mean, you don't, you can actually have this efficient and effective way of publication where you're not doing all of the work yourself. That can take a long time. You can sort of delegate some of the work to other people or work with them in tandem. But also, I think it's building bridges and building collaborations across the field and sort of co-authorship and collaborations can enrich your work in ways that often you may not have thought about something yourself, and somebody else coming on your project can help you see something that you haven't. So it's also expanding your horizons of ideas and research. So I'll stop there because there's a lot more to say about this, but I'll see if Lori and Tracey have anything to say, and then we can go to questions.
Great, thank you. Did either of the other 2 panelists want to add anything before we get to the Q&A? Yep.
I just want to add, it's probably kind of intimidating to approach your professor if you want to publish. So I understand that can be very difficult. In general, if you're working as a research assistant on a project, at least if I was supervising the project, I would expect you to be co-authoring a publication with me, or more than one. But there's different rules and expectations. So I'm at a point in my career where I'm pretty busy doing a bunch of different projects at the same time. And so I'm happy if somebody takes the role of the first author by writing the first draft. So my rule is as long as you've written a decent enough first draft, then your name can be on the front of the paper. Now that there's different, depending on the collaborations that you have, though, there's different rules. So most projects, the investigators have that discussion before they begin to collect data, and certainly before they begin to publish on it. And so some collaborations, and this varies by discipline, and as a sociologist, actually, you're going to find yourself to be in interdisciplinary projects all the time. Some disciplines have rules. So the principal investigator, for instance, that person's name needs to go at the end usually, especially if it's a health or a science type article, because the conventions in the field is that the principal investigator is always identified as the person who's last. And the person who's first is usually identified as the main researcher, usually the person who wrote the first draft of the article. Also, when you're collaborating, especially when it's research that has been funded by an agency, you need to make the proper acknowledgement. So usually the funding agency has a strict set of like the sentence or two that you have to use as part of the acknowledgement. Sometimes they require you to put the grant number as well. And so when you're making collaborations, making sure that you identify all the grantors, because sometimes you're working on a project that's so big that you have multiple agencies that are funding you. And so making sure you don't forget them as collaborators as well is embarrassing if you have to send in a request because you've forgotten that. Those are kind of the tricky bits about working as collaborators. I always feel like you know, as a writer and as a professor, that discussion needs to happen before anybody writes anything, so that it avoids problems. And as the kind of the lead researcher or the professor for the group of students who might be writing, sometimes I find I have to delegate that task. And so I try to delegate it in ways that, you know, gives the maximum number of my students the chance to write, but also the chance to be the first author.
Great, thank you. Dr. Adams, was there anything you wanted to add, or?
No, I think the responses by Pallavi and Laurie have been very thorough, so I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so to get into the Q&A, our first question from the audience is, for the sociology job market, how important are publications in sociology journals versus interdisciplinary journals? For example, in my field of international migration, many journals are multidisciplinary, and I'm unsure whether this will be respected if I'm looking for jobs in sociology departments in Canada. Who would like to address that question?
I'll take a stab at it. I think what matters more is the quality of the journal. So if it's peer reviewed, what kind of, not so much its ranking, like most people, if you're applying for a job in the Canadian labor market for sociology, and you're applying for an immigration position, the immigration specialists on the job panel will know what these journals are. So I wouldn't be so worried about whether or not it's sociology or interdisciplinary. And that would apply for, you know, any other sub-discipline in sociology too. Usually if you're applying for a job in that field, there's people on the panel who at least know something about it and would be able to say that's a good journal. But I don't think it matters so much that if it's interdisciplinary or sociology.
Great, thank you.
I also think that it's, you know, some journals are truly interdisciplinary and some journals are just not generalist journals within sociology. So for instance, International Migration Review publish a lot of sociologists, but it can be an interdisciplinary journal, right? Or refugee studies, a journal of refugee studies. Whereas a journal, the Canadian Review of Sociology, is a more generalist journal. And often, like when you have the term sociology in a journal, they get categorized as a sociology journal, and you know, something like Gender and Society, which comes out of the Sociologist for Women in Society, is a sociology journal but does not have the term sociology. And often, you know, I've had students ask me if this is a interdisciplinary journal or it's just a gender journal, right? Like, so those categorizations are sometimes really hard to assess. And so again, consult somebody in, you know, somebody who knows and who's been in the field a little longer than you have about those. And again, I agree with Laurie that the quality of the journal matters more than if you are you know, if you are publishing in interdisciplinary journals. Having said that, I do think that because of the nature of the job market, I mean, it's good to stick to more social science oriented journals in the first few things that you publish than not. But again, the quality of the journal is really what's essential here.
Thank you. Okay, our next question. Should graduate students and postdocs consider publishing research notes rather than traditional journal articles? When might this be appropriate?
I'll try and answer this one. I think that, I don't think it's an instead of, it can be an addition to. I do think that there's a value for early academics. Like research notes tend to be shorter and more focused on the research. If you're trying to make work in a discipline, then engaging a little bit more deeply with the literature in that area and making a contribution that way, you know, is probably a significant thing that you might want to do. But having a balance, right, where you're publishing some articles and some research notes. The other thing is that I have as an editor, and I've had this happen to me as an author, where I've submitted a paper as one thing, and then I've had the editor come back and say, you know what, I think this is actually maybe more appropriate for a research note, so how about we try over there? And I've done the same as an editor. So, you know, you might even just want to, if you've got an article and you're not sure where it's placed and you want to try and place it in a certain journal, but you're not sure where it's best, have a conversation with the editor. They're really just an email away. And that might also help, you know, guide you in terms of how you write that up. Research notes are nice if you've got some quick findings that are significant or interesting that you just want to get out there, but they're not going to have the in-depth engagement with the literature and the discipline that, you know, I think for many of your papers you'll want to have.
Thank you. Okay, our next question. Sometimes it can take a while for a manuscript to come together. In the meantime, others can publish on similar topics, similar results or findings. How should we address this in our own work? Would it be better to consider another journal or revise the work to still contribute to that journal?
So in my opinion, I guess it depends, but if you've chosen a journal for a specific reason, then I think it makes sense, right? Because that is a journal that's publishing in your area, they're publishing things on your topic. That's probably exactly the journal where you want to publish. That's the audience you want to engage with. And it rarely happens that somebody has published something that's exactly the same as yours. So you just need to maybe work a little harder to clarify your contribution. You mention that other article and you talk about how you're extending it, how you're expanding upon it, how you're improving on it. And then that's actually probably an ideal situation to be in. Again, you found a journal that's interested in your topic. You found an audience that's reading things in your area. So it's just about, you know, to use the term that Laura used earlier, it's to some extent it's about marketing, right? How can you place your article as being distinct and finding that niche that's really moving the field forward in a different way than the other article that is in some ways similar to yours.
I just want to echo that too. That very, very, very rarely happens. Like, you know, in the 7 years I was editor, I've never seen that happen. You know, and if you think about it, qualitative research, that's not replicatable, right? So you're guaranteed to be doing something different and have different data than the people who are publishing in that area. If you're looking at a quantitative data set, say you're using the General Social Survey, even if you're addressing the same question that somebody else has addressed using that database, I am betting a lot of money that you're using a different set of variables, a different set of methodology. And so I would be very surprised if any of you ever come into that situation.
I would agree with that. I think we, at the end, we do interpretive work, and how we look at the world is really, would be different, right? So I remember when I was in the second year of my PhD, somebody at ASA came up to me and said, oh, this person has done exactly the research you have done. And I was like, I am not, you know, it honestly, it like, for a minute, it kind of pulled the carpet under my feet. And then I was like, well, I'm not working in a physics lab, right? So my sample is not their sample. Like, I am, you know, it can be this, even if it's the same research question, they are different groups of people, and they come with different histories and different backgrounds and such. Anyway, so that, you know, so I had that happen, and it turned out well. So you can relax. But I also think that that is a fear, and I want to acknowledge that. And that happens at every stage, right? So we often feel like, oh, you know, this person is doing similar work. What if they say everything that you have to say? So, you know, that I want to acknowledge that, but I also think what Laurie said is really important. But the other part of this is whether you should pull an article from a journal because it's taking a long time. And that's a good question, and that's a separate question, right? Because of late, that has happened multiple times. And it was recently that I actually pulled an article from a journal, and, you know, I'm not going to name the journal here, not sure what legal implications that have, but it was a second round of reviews, and I did not hear back from them in 14 months after repeatedly, you know, sending them emails, until I said, well, if I don't hear from you in the next month, I'm going to pull the article. And they had lost they had not sent it out for reviews again. And at that point, I pulled that paper and I sent it somewhere else, and it's now being it'll be published within the year, right? So it did take a long time because of that time, but then, you know, you can make that call if nothing is moving, but it's often not advisable to pull a paper from a journal if it's in the process. Like if it's getting revisions and if it's, you know, moving along, then I think if you choose a journal for a particular reason, it's good to follow through, because if you pull it and, you know, send it to another journal, it might take as long. So you're not actually saving time by pulling a paper from a journal, unless the situation is what I went through, where, you know, the article didn't move for 14 months at all.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have 2 more questions and 2 minutes, so I think we're gonna get through them. At the Canadian Review of Sociology, how general do papers need to be in order to be accepted? Do papers need to be written differently than at a specialist journal? For example, should the author change what audience they have in mind?
So at the Canadian Review of Sociology, they don't really have to be too different, but I think it is important. You know, sometimes we write on things, I do myself, that are really directed at a specialist audience and are really on some kind of niche topic. And ideally at the Canadian Review of Sociology, we are looking for things that just the general sociologist without any background in your field is going to find interesting. And most sociologists really do have broad interests and a broad range of things. But if something's just really too specialized, that's where maybe, we might not publish something if it just doesn't seem like it would be of interest to the general reader. And in terms of how you write it up, it's really not going to be all that different. But it may be the case that there's a certain jargon or something in your subfield that wouldn't be understood in the general field. It might be valuable for you to define key terms. I mean, that's always a good thing to do anyway. But often in subfields, we have our own jargon and our own short forms and abbreviations that we understand in that subfield that even a general sociologist might not. Those are the kinds of changes you should make for a generalist journal. But you don't really need to make a lot of changes at all.
Great, thank you. Okay, so our very last question. A few times the panelists mentioned emailing the editor of a journal to inquire whether a paper is a good fit. I had never heard of this before. How common is this practice?
It's not that I get emails all the time at the CRS, but it's not that uncommon that I am approached. I would say that it happens at least once or twice a month, where somebody, especially if they're not certain if something fits a mandate. And also, sometimes you have questions, right? And I've certainly done it myself. If the journal guidelines say that they want articles that are 8,000 words and mine's 8,500, I'm emailing the editor, like, how serious are you about this 8,000 words? Mine's slightly over, but otherwise I think I'm a great fit for this journal. Would you be able to look at it longer? I mean, sometimes you have questions and the editor's there to answer them. So from my point of view as an editor, but also as an author, it's not that uncommon.
I'd have to agree. I would get, probably half a dozen inquiries a month. Does this paper fit? And sometimes just by the description, it doesn't fit. So sometimes people try to shop bad papers around. And so that gives the editor a chance to give some feedback to the writer to say, well, this is not an appropriate journal. What kind of sad to see. So my journal was with Springer Publications, and Springer's kind of business model was to try not to reject anything. So in the later years where I was editor, papers that we rejected, they got shopped around to other journals that Springer owned, or they would get shopped around to, become book chapters in books that Springer would put together. And not so sure that's great for you. I think trying to find an appropriate journal on your own is usually better. So I was never a fan of that. But I do want to mention just one really important thing. The most important thing that you can do when you submit an article for review is please put down reviewers. And so if they ask you for 3 reviewers, put down their names and give their email addresses. So I know Tracey experiences this too. It was the bane of my existence. I'd often have to approach between 12 and 17 people per article before I got one person who agreed to review. So oftentimes that list of 3 or that list of 6, like, try to maximize that list. Again, as I said to you, try to pick people that would be reasonable reviewers. People to be reasonable reviewers usually review. And the flip side of this is this. If you're asked to review, please review articles, because that is the biggest holdup in terms of the process, is trying to find somebody to do the review and to actually do it in a timely fashion. And I actually kind of agree with this practice, which is being instituted in some of the major science journals right now. And that is that you won't be allowed to publish in those journals unless you've done 3 reviews for the journal. And I actually think that's the carrot that's needed, because you would be surprised at the number of people who turn down reviews. That said, if you have to turn down a review, the best thing that you can do for the editor is give them a suggestion. One or two other, like, I'm sorry, I don't have time to do this right now, or it's a little bit outside of my expertise. May I suggest you contact this person or this person? That is so helpful and speeds up the publication process enormously. And so that's something that you should keep in mind as new writers, because the PhD students may be asked to review, actually, especially if you've published before, and you can put that on your CV as well.
I just want to add just this little thing, that it's interesting that the person who asked the question said that they had not heard of this practice before, and I can see why, because I want to emphasize that this has been a more of a gendered and racialized practice. So white men were very comfortable reaching out to editors to ask if something fit, or and so this used to be a practice which was started by white men, and now is being actually the sociologists of women in society actually did a short research for gender in society to point that out, that there was this discrepancy. So yeah, I mean, I think it's good if you are unsure if the paper fits or not, reach out to the editor, and then the editor can even direct you to another journal that you may not have known of.
Great, thank you all very, very much. That was a great discussion, a lot of insightful comments and suggestions. I also want to thank all our audience members for attending and for sharing your questions as well. We'll be sending a feedback survey out to all audience members, and we'd appreciate if you could fill that out. But yeah, thank you all for joining us, and we hope you found the series helpful.